Ever since we humans reached something approaching more or less global consensus that it was carbon, in the form of carbon dioxide, that was by far the main driver of increased warming in our atmosphere, the concept of placing a tax on the production and emission of carbon has been widely debated. As far back as the start of the 1990s, the Scandinavian countries all implemented some form of carbon taxing or pricing in their economies. But despite this visionary world leadership, the rest of us did precisely nothing at all for at least another 2 decades. Even today, the average global carbon tax is a paltry $2 a tonne. Last week though, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, released a new study suggesting that if we're to stand any chance at all of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100, then that tax would have to increase to $75 a tonne by 2030. So how on earth are we going to achieve that? Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think. Here's the full chart published in the IMF report. It shows which countries have put in place a carbon tax system, when that system was put in place, and crucially, how big a share of global carbon emissions those taxes cover. You can see the Scandinavian countries way back in the early 90s blazing the trail for the rest of us, followed by a long period of stagnation until other nations finally started to catch up. Even today, in 2019, carbon pricing schemes affect less than 15% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So why isn't more being done? Here in the UK, the government took the view in 2012 that the EU cap and trade system, which sets an overall ceiling on emissions from key industries and allows companies to buy and sell carbon permits, was only having a relatively muted effect on emissions because of a glut of permits on the market. So in 2013, the UK Parliament enacted a carbon price floor for certain sectors, including electricity. That effectively meant a carbon tax of about $25 per tonne, and that had a profound effect on UK energy production. In 2012, coal made up 42% of UK electricity generation. Within 6 years, that figure had dropped to well below 5%, while renewables like wind, solar, hydro and biomass increased from 10% in 2012 to a record high of almost 34% in 2018, rapidly catching up with natural gas as the largest UK energy source. So carbon tax and pricing is the perfect solution, right? All our governments should immediately implement similar policies and we solve the climate crisis within a decade. Yeah, right, if only life was that simple. In fact, one of the strongest accusations levelled against carbon taxation is that it hurts people on lower incomes far more than people on higher incomes. Here's one point of view presented by Kate Aronoff in The Guardian in response to the IMF report. In the context of gaping inequality, says Kate, any climate policy that doesn't look to make the economy more equal overall will be dead on arrival. She goes on to point out that the reason people have taken to the streets against fuel price hikes from France to Ecuador is pretty straightforward. The rich can afford to adjust and the poor can't. And she concludes that barring huge state investments that allow the majority of people to lead lower carbon lives through public transit, energy efficient housing and much more, even a tax with dividends paid back to the public is going to be met with protest. It's a view that, pretty ironically, is enthusiastically endorsed by the Heartland and Manhattan Institutes and American Energy Alliance in the United States, all of whom are nothing more than faintly veiled propaganda vehicles for the fossil fuel industry, and all of whom could surely have hardly believed their luck when they realised that left-wing commentators were objecting to carbon taxes, albeit with entirely different motives to their own. But this article by Ed Dolan at medium.com takes a more holistic view of carbon tax and its implications for the less well-off. He first points to a 2009 study by the US National Bureau of Economic Research, which found that the top 20% of earners in the US were responsible for almost 35% of total emissions, compared to just under 10% of emissions from the poorest 20% of American society. The obvious conclusion from that report was that foregoing a carbon tax in order to keep energy prices low is an absurdly inefficient way to help the poor. Based on their share of national emissions, the top 40% would capture 58% of the benefits of such a policy. And the very richest households would gain 3.5 times more than the very poorest. The article goes on to look at a more recent 2017 study. This one, Dolan tells us, considered not only the direct impact of carbon tax on household energy prices, but also the indirect impact on prices of goods like housing, food and clothing. In addition to income, the study also looked at the impact of carbon taxes in proportion to household consumption expenditures, which are more stable from year to year than income. They also accounted for the fact that transfer payments to low-income households in the US are indexed to rise automatically when prices increase, whether because of general inflation or due to a policy change like a carbon tax. When all of those factors are considered, the authors of the report found that the impact of carbon tax is more equally distributed in proportion to household income and consumption than the conventional wisdom assumes. According to the report, the burden of a carbon tax as a percentage of household income varies only slightly from 0.54% of income for the poorest income decile to 0.46% of income for the wealthiest decile. If the calculation is done as a percentage of consumption rather than a percentage of income, the impact of a carbon tax on wealthy households is actually proportionately greater than on poorer households. On July the 1st, 2012, Australia's then Labour government under Prime Minister Julia Gillard introduced a carbon price of 23 Australian dollars per tonne. To offset the impact of the tax, Labour reduced income tax and increased welfare payments to cover expected price increases. It also introduced compensation for some affected industries. The Australian National University estimated that the scheme cut carbon emissions by about 17 million tonnes just in 2013, the biggest annual reduction in 24 years of Australian records. But scaremongering about the effects of carbon pricing helped opposition leader Tony Abbott to a landslide election victory in 2013, and he promptly repealed the tax.
Clearer commitment that this government took to the election than our commitment to abolish the carbon tax.
As a consequence, Australia's emissions went up again. With 0.3% of the world's population, they produce 1.8% of the world's greenhouse gases. The biggest lesson from this absolute debacle down under is that one of the most important factors in making a success of any carbon pricing scheme is bipartisan political agreement and support for the initiative. It was exactly that kind of political consensus that enabled the Scandinavian countries to get ahead of the game so early on. Sweden's carbon tax, for example, is the highest in the world. They started out with a tax of about 24 euros per tonne in 1991 and increased it gradually to allow households and businesses time to adapt. The tax rate has now reached 114 euros per tonne. But look how that country's greenhouse gas emissions have fallen while their gross domestic product has grown since the tax was introduced nearly 30 years ago. So what about the planet's two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, China and the United States? Well, of course, Xi Jinping doesn't need to worry about bipartisan political consensus because the ruling party in China has absolute power and he himself is now effectively ensconced as national leader for life. But President Xi does recognise climate change as a very real problem. And after 2 years spent finalising legal and technical infrastructure, China expects to make the first trade on its long-awaited national emission trading scheme in 2020. And as we've seen on many occasions, once China gets properly behind an initiative, the results are usually on a scale that dwarfs anything else on the planet. And this one is no exception. If we look back at our chart of countries, we can see that the Chinese scheme, coming into place in 2020, is predicted to place a punitive price on more carbon emissions than the whole of the EU combined. By contrast, there is no political consensus in the United States, a country where even the very concept that our climate may be warming as a direct result of human greenhouse gas emissions still remains more of an ideological debate rather than a simple acceptance of overwhelming scientific evidence. Add to that the almost unassailable lobbying influence of the fossil fuel industry in the corridors of national political power in Washington, and you get the hopeless stalemate currently paralysing the US Congress. So it's left to individual states to show leadership on this potentially pivotal issue. Currently, these 10 states, representing more than a quarter of the US population and a third of GDP, do have carbon pricing programs in place and are successfully reducing emissions. But as usual with anything to do with climate change mitigation, carbon pricing is clearly not a simple silver bullet solution to our looming emergency. Socio-economic policy will have to be very carefully constructed to ensure any tax system doesn't end up unfairly hurting the lowest earners in our society, who are least able to cope with unexpected hikes in their monthly expenditure. On the flip side, wherever carbon pricing has been properly implemented around the globe, it does appear to have resulted in real tangible reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly a thorny issue, and no doubt one that many of you will have strong views about one way or another. So I look forward to reading your arguments in the comments section below. That's it for this week though. Please do give us a like and a share, and if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to the channel to help get our content noticed by the YouTube search algorithm so that we can get the information to as many people as possible. And don't forget to click on the little bell icon so you get notified of whenever the new topics get published each week. It's completely free and dead easy to do that. All you need to do is click on that icon there. As always, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.